Welcome to today's webinar from background noise to alarm bells. The focus of today's discussion is on exposing the impact of climate change on Indigenous peoples and small island states, the global security challenges it creates, as well as highlighting tireless youth activism around the world advocating for urgent climate action. We aim to explore and highlight visions of a truly inclusive climate action that leaves no one behind. Thank you all very much for joining us today for this very important and timely discussion. I would like to introduce today's speakers. The program will start with a keynote address from Roseanne Archibald, who is joining us from Canada despite the early morning hour. As Ontario Regional Chief, Ms. Archibald is well known for her dedication to empowering Indigenous women and youth in seeking community-based solutions that encourage capacity building. As such, she represents generational change, breaking barriers, bringing diplomacy, and encouraging unity in the First Nations political system in Canada. Mr. Miguel van der Velden, who is the Caribbean Regional Coordinator for the World's Youth Climate Justice, and also a coordinator for the Caribbean Youth Environment Network. He works together with youth from across the world to find effective solutions for the climate crisis, and advocating with governments to request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice concerning the consequences of the climate crisis for youth. Our next speaker will be Mr. Ralph Regenwanu, who is joining us from the Republic of Vanuatu in the late evening hours of Friday. Thank you very much for joining us. Following his position as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Vanuatu, he is currently the leader of the opposition of the government. He has a background in cultural heritage management, and he also played a leading role in the development of Vanuatu's National Sustainable Development Plan, which was launched in early 2017. His presentation will be followed by the one by Ms. Molly Kaluk, who is a Gender, Climate and Security Advisor at the United Nations Environment Programme in Geneva. Her focus is on designing programmatic and policy solutions to address peace and security challenges associated with climate change, environmental degradation, and gender inequality. She was the lead author on the recent policy report titled Gender, Climate and Security, Sustaining Inclusive Peace on the Front Lines of Climate Change, which offers a conceptual framework on linkages between these issues and provides concrete policy recommendations. Last but certainly not least, Ms. Anya Olin Pape, who is an expert on youth and policy development at the Global Challenges Foundation, where she works to advance global governance models that fit 21st century's needs and limits the risk of climate crisis, ecological collapse, and nuclear war. She leads the work of the Foundation's ambitions to increase youth involvement on the international level and the United Nations in particular. We have a very impressive line of speakers today and a very busy program, of course. So without much ado, I would like to invite Ms. Archibald, Chief Archibald, to give her presentation today.
Thank you, Sylvia. It's good to see you again. I know it's been quite some time. So I'm going to start with some words in my own language first. And so Wachi Misway, Roseanne Archibald, Natishnagasan, Dagutagamash. Hi everyone, I'm Ontario Regional Chief Roseanne Archibald, and I am coming to you today from my own home territory of Taykwa Nation. I'm really happy to be with you virtually today. It is 5:30 in the morning here, so please forgive me if I'm a little bit groggy. First, I would like to acknowledge the Creator, the world around us, and our place within it. I'll be doing a shorter presentation than requested in order to leave more time for questions and answers. So in preparation for this keynote, my staff researched a number of documents, some of which I'll be quoting directly and others which I'll paraphrase. These documents include the United Nations Cultural Rights and Climate Change Report, the Human Rights Watch First Nations and Food Security Report, the Assembly of First Nations resolution declaring a First Nations climate emergency, the Assembly of First Nations 2020 Climate Change Gathering Report, and the Assembly of First Nations National Climate Strategy discussion paper. I acknowledge the vast information in these many reports, but I'm going to narrow my focus onto First Nations in Ontario. The subject of this keynote is the detrimental impact of climate change on First Nations and barriers to climate action. First of all, we are facing multiple crises. We have a climate crisis. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change projects that we have less than 10 years to avoid locking in a future of catastrophic consequences. We have a biodiversity crisis. The Intergenerational Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services projects the extinction of 1 million species in the next few decades, which will be accelerated by climate change. And we have a health crisis. The global pandemic, COVID-19, has affected every single one of our communities. The similarity between these crises is not only the disproportionate impacts facing First Nations due to colonization and structural inequities, but also the significant contributions that First Nations bring to these intersectional crises. First Nations are the active drivers and leaders of climate action, ready and prepared to advance transformative climate action based on First Nations governance, knowledge systems, and reciprocal relationships to Mother Earth. These perspectives must lead the development of solutions that are inclusive, holistic, and interconnected, while simultaneously focusing on addressing decolonization and decarbonization. The unfortunate reality in Canada is that, in particular, the North continues to experience climate change at a rate 3 times faster than the rest of the world. This means that a 3-degree global average temperature increase would result in a 9-degree increase in the North. At the same time, despite the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, Canada is not projected to meet its 2030 targets. A truly transformative approach is needed. In the summer of 2019, the Assembly of First Nations National Office passed a resolution declaring a First Nations climate emergency, drawing on the leadership of the Vuntut Gwich'in First Nation, that's Old Crow in the Yukon. In the resolution, First Nations declared that climate change constitutes a state of emergency for our lands, waters, animals, and peoples. From this perspective, it's not just a global shift and movement away from the status quo, but a revitalization of value systems that connect us to the land and natural laws that govern our interactions with all of creation. This revitalization is central to the development of the Assembly of First Nations National Climate Strategy as mandated by the Chiefs in Assembly. I want to read some key sections of the UN Climate, Culture, Rights, and Climate Change report and make some commentary on them as it relates to First Nations. First, on page 13, paragraph 45, it highlights that climate change negatively affects the practice of traditional knowledge in many places, including the very know-how and techniques needed to respond to such change. This is due to unpredictable weather and changing seasons, which impair harvests, fishing, and food. The province of Ontario, where I am today, is warming much faster than the average, and the remote north, where the majority of people are First Nations, it's warming even faster. First Nations are reporting a number of visible changes in insects, migration patterns, plants, animals, and their ability to hunt and trap. In Southern Ontario, we are noticing, for example, less bumblebees, and in the remote north, there are visibly fewer butterflies. There are less and less swallows and hummingbirds. There are new bird species in the area, more ticks on moose, bringing increased animal diseases, fewer lily pads, and hunting seasons are delayed with shorter timeframes. Second, on page 14 in paragraph 50, the report states, climate change induced damage and destruction of culture and cultural heritage can have a particularly significant effect on Indigenous peoples, for whom connection to place, land, and landscape and relationships with culturally important animals, plants, habitats, and ecosystems play such an important role in shaping heritage, laws, worldviews, practices, and identity. We see this right across Ontario, where climate change can impact a cultural activity that is related to harvesting. For example, in the Great Lakes area, increased pollution and water temperature fluctuations can impact the spawning cycles of fish, which have a direct impact on First Nations, whose cultural heritage includes fishing for sustenance and also their strong connection to their fisheries. More specifically, let's talk about clan systems. First Nation peoples are governed by their clan systems, whether it's bear, sturgeon, wolf, heron, or many of the other clan families. They are protectors of that animal, and that relationship is what draws their connection to the land as well. If we lose these animals due to climate change, then we also lose a connection to our identity. I want to turn to barriers to climate action, and I'll quote again the UN Culture Rights and Climate Change Report and elaborate further. First, on page 14 in paragraph 51, it states, lack of respect for land rights and rights to natural resources exacerbates the vulnerabilities of Indigenous people to grave cultural losses due to climate change. A barrier to climate action is non-Indigenous people not always understanding their own connection to the land. If non-Indigenous people understood and respected Indigenous land rights and rights to natural resources, they would know that we all come from the land, and therefore they would come to appreciate that their relationship to the land is a crucial part of their existence. This would result in strong climate action to protect the environment for future generations. Second, on page 7 in paragraph 21, it states, many environmental policies do not address culture, while many cultural policies do not refer to the environment. What is needed is a tripartite integration of environmental, cultural, and human rights perspectives on climate change. The inability to have a holistic perspective is definitely a barrier to climate action. First Nations have known for millennia that everything is connected and interdependent, which brings me back to the beginning of my presentation where I mentioned we are facing intersectional crises. As a result, our solutions must be multifaceted, holistic, and strengthen the interconnectedness of all of us who have a reciprocal relationship to Mother Earth. In closing, I want to acknowledge the research that has been done in the Assembly of First Nations National Climate Strategy discussion paper, which highlights First Nations' deep connections to the land, which has enabled us to live in a state of balance with all creation since time immemorial. The time has come for First Nations to take their rightful place as leaders in climate action and in determining climate solutions. My call to action for all of us is to join together to stop the destruction of the planet and the negative impacts of climate change, not only on First Nations, but for all of us and the 7 generations ahead. Thank you, Sylvia, for inviting me today, and I look forward to taking any questions that you may have. Ninanaskamon in my language means I am thankful, I am grateful, I thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Roseanne. This was a very informative presentation. I particularly value the how you take the United Nations reports and link that to the everyday reality in First Nations communities. I think it's really important that we can connect those written documents to actually what's happening on the ground and take action based on that. Thank you so much. Before we turn to the next speaker, just a very quick question which was submitted by one of the speakers to you directly. And the question is, how can young people take local action to spread awareness and advance the recognition of Indigenous and community land rights?
Well, the first thing you could do is reach out to the Indigenous people that are connected to the area where you live. If you are in a country where that might not be as evident, then there are certainly groups that are dedicated to climate action. And when I met you, Sylvia, we talked about this great interest in Europe to have connections to First Nations and Indigenous people around the world. So I think that even if you are living in a country, but you see something happening in, say, South America somewhere, then the planet is, I think the planet would welcome your action. So I would say for us in Canada, definitely reach out to the Indigenous people in the area that are connected to an issue that you want to promote. But even if you're in Europe and you think about deforestation in Brazil, then again, reach out to the Indigenous people and make those partnerships so that you can actually have an impact on that issue. That would be my advice.
Thank you so much, Roseanne. Indeed, we talked a lot about how important it is to build these relationships and partnerships. Thank you again. And now I would like to invite Miguel van der Velden to give his presentation. My apologies.
Thank you. And I want to start by giving a big thanks as well to Chief Archibald. Yeah, I'm very grateful and honored to be sharing the floor with you, but as well as with all the other speakers as well. As a youth activist and someone who dedicates quite a lot of their life and time to climate change, but also Indigenous rights and Indigenous issues, it's always nice to connect with others who are working on the same issues. So I should start off by introducing myself. My name is Miguel van der Velden. I am from the island of Aruba in the Caribbean. With regards to what I'm going to talk about today, I want to start off my story talking about an ancestor of mine, my great-great-grandfather, who was called, his name is Eleuterio Yajaira Paz, and he was a palabrero of the Wayu indigenous people in Venezuela. And what that actually means is that he is actually essentially a traditional lawyer. And the reason I want to start with that is to introduce this concept of, justice being a concept that runs, throughout cultures and throughout generations as well. And I'll touch on that later. And he was actually one of the people who managed to negotiate the peace and cooperation between his Wayu communities and the Venezuelan government. And a big inspiration for me in what I do today as well. So I am here as the Caribbean Regional Coordinator for the World's Youth for Climate Justice. We are essentially a coalition of young people from across the world, in the Caribbean, Europe, Pacific, Asia, working together to find, to support and extend this solution that we see at a global scale for the climate crisis, which is bringing climate change to the International Court of Justice. And the reason that the the take that we are taking on this is actually looking at the climate crisis from the perspective of intergenerational justice. I think this is a term that needs to be introduced to a lot of people, because it's something that we've never really had to think about very thoroughly, because all of the conflicts and the issues that we have had in the past, have generally been have affected either the people who are directly involved in that issue at the time, or perhaps into the near future. Climate change could be the first issue that we have ever seen in the history of us as a species, where we are actually talking about decreasing the quality of lives of generations to come compared to the generations that have come before us. So we are actually introducing this idea of, we want justice between peoples, and we want justice for generations as well. The generations that are growing up now, and the children of the generations that are growing up now should have the same quality of life and the same opportunities that everyone has had up to this point. And we are looking at this from an international law perspective. Just as my ancestor Eleuterio, he had to negotiate both the traditional law system as well as the Venezuelan law system at the time. We have this international law system in place now, and we have to actually use what we have to make a difference. This is, and I think this is something that, if I can bring it back as well to a story that is a story of my island on Aruba. We have a character called Companansi, and essentially he is this trickster type of character who would always find a way to make the situation which would play against his odds, find a way to turn that around and actually use that for his own, to achieve his own goals. So that's actually what we're trying to do. We have this system in place, and we want to actually use it now to actually benefit us, the environment, the world, and the generations to come, rather than, I guess, what we are doing with it now. So I want to actually show a video now that will introduce this idea of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on climate change. So I'll do that now, and then I'll add something at the end.
In every year of the last decade, our world has seen greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise and shatter records. But those responsible for burning the most fossil fuels have not experienced the most direct consequences of climate change. It has been us. The hundreds of millions of people living on the front line of the climate crisis. If global temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius in my lifetime, countries like mine will vanish beneath the waves. I will be forced to leave the land where my ancestors are buried, and to tell my children they have nowhere to call home. At Rio de Janeiro, Kyoto, and later at Paris, we were promised action. But despite ever more opportunities to address this crisis, the planet is hurtling towards climate catastrophe. Existing international agreements have not provided countries with legal clarity on their responsibilities to reduce emissions, leading to inaction. To break the impasse, the UN General Assembly must request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change and human rights. All it would take is a simple majority vote from UN member states. An advisory opinion is not legally binding but carries great legal and moral authority, encouraging all nations to protect the human rights of people affected by climate change. An opinion from the highest court in the world would also help to build a critical global coalition uniting governments and international institutions, and would define exactly what existing bodies of laws nations should follow. In the past, advisory opinions have been instrumental in establishing international laws on the right to self-determination, the prevention of genocide, and nuclear disarmament. We believe it could do the same for climate change. A planet in crisis doesn't have to be our future. If there is power in the world to save humanity from environmental disaster, it is the power of the people. But time is running out, and we have to act now. Please visit our website to join us.
So that was a quick introduction to the actual concept of what we're doing. And I think what we talk about as well in the video, which is really important and which Chief Archibald has touched on as well, is how do we actually connect these global issues to what is actually happening on the ground in people's personal lives. What I've found so far in all of the work that I've done on climate change is that I don't manage to convince anyone to care about the climate crisis more than they already do by feeding them numbers and facts. You know, for some reason, it's not sufficient to say to someone that we are the only generation ever or the generation to have lived with the most carbon dioxide ever in the history of our human species, or the generation to live in the hottest environment globally ever in our history as a species. But what actually does manage to connect people is the actual human stories. What made me interested and what made me decide to dedicate my time to climate change is hearing the stories from people who are personally affected and who have personally had their lives changed and uprooted by what is happening. When you think of, you know, sea level rise, and when you think of communities being relocated because their islands are no longer habitable, which is already happening in the Pacific, for example, we don't immediately think of the actual individual people who are going through that change in their life. They are actually having to leave their homes, force their homes. You know, imagine being in that position where you are the person going through that. And or if you are someone in the Caribbean who has just seen the largest hurricane ever 2 years ago pass over your island and destroy all the homes and all the infrastructure on your island, and you are now seeing that in another week another level 5 hurricane is going to hit your island. That feeling of dread, you know, that is what is powering the climate action right now, and that is what we need to connect to this global campaign. So that is what we're actually aiming to do with the advisory opinion on the advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. We want the International Court of Justice to actually hear the stories from individual people, so that we have an understanding of who are the victims here, who are actually suffering in their daily lives. And so we are working together with youth from around the world, youth from universities, from different organizations. And there's a lot of ways for people to join our campaign. And it's not just youth, but we are reaching out to whoever we can, even though this is a youth-led campaign. So, you know, a lot of people have been asking me, how can we actually join this? I think the best thing we can do is look at what, you know, going back to the story I was telling about using your personal circumstance to actually use that to achieve your own goal. What is it, what position are you in right now? And what are the actual strengths and skills that you can provide? You know, it's more important to think about how to apply those to what we are doing now than to learn a whole new set of skills. So with a lot of youth, for example, are actually encouraging whatever university or organization they might be a part of to support this campaign. So if you're a student in a university, you can write to your dean or your professors or whoever might be able to make this decision and ask for a formal support of this campaign. And the same thing can be with any organization. Then aside from that, we have been seeing so much really exciting action from youth in actually regenerating the environment as well. In the Solomon Islands a couple of weeks ago, a small group of youth have been able to actually encourage donors to donate trees, indigenous trees, which they have then gone and plant to regenerate this specific part of the island, which was completely degraded. So now we have this environment actually being regenerated with indigenous trees, thanks to the action from this youth. So this is another example of what youth are doing at a community level. And so I think finally to come back to the idea of the kind of the UN level and the international or global level, we have this relationship between what we call the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach. This is something I think that we need to get rid of. Are we doing either this one or are we doing that one? We need to actually just look at what's already happening, and we need to grow that because there is so much happening already, and to extend that to whatever region we can where there are people excited to do this work. I think, looking at climate change, it's not just, even though this I've given you a lot of information about, through this video, and I've told you about how people's lives are being uprooted, but it's actually such a opportunity for us to really now, look back at the society that we've had. And a lot of youth are saying, we don't want to live in that society that we had anyway. So we now get to actually rethink our society and actually rebuild and create a world that we actually do want to live in. So this World's Youth for Climate Justice is just one way that we are hoping to achieve that. Thank you very much for giving me this time to speak.
Thank you very much, Miguel. And I can only say I very much admire your dedication and ambition to settle for nothing less than an ICJ advisory opinion. But we are faced with a massive crisis and massive humanitarian crisis in this situation. So do not settle for little things. And at the same time, also you highlight the small actions on the local level, like planting trees by the youth. Those are equally important. And indeed, it's very valuable that we find ways to coordinate these actions worldwide. There were two very specific questions posed already by the public, one of which you already answered actually during your presentation, which was asking what can individuals do to push their governments to vote in favor of requesting for the advisory opinion. Would you like to reflect a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so as I was saying, I think, of course, individuals, the more people that want to join and work together with us, the better. So if you would like to reach out, please do reach out through our website. But if you would like to just start off already, I think, as I said, whatever organization you are a part of, or if it's a school, if it's a university, I mean, it doesn't have to be a university, it can be a secondary school too. If you can get that institution to actually, make a formal request to your government to support this ICJO, I think that's very powerful. And so, one of the things that we're looking at too, for example, is in the Caribbean, we have islands that are overseas countries and territories, and they don't actually get a vote at the ICJO. So instead of going straight to the country, we are actually asking the islands to support this by requesting the country that they fall under that would be voting for them, requesting from them to support the ICJO. So it's just look at the institution, organization, or whether it's an island, whether it's local government, and get them to support this formally and publicly.
Thank you very much, Miguel. And I would like to invite Mr. Regenwanu in Vanuatu to give his presentations. Earlier, he had some difficulties with his internet connection. I'm hoping that has been solved now. Mr. Regenwanu, are you still with us?
Yes, thank you, Sylvia. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with all of you. I represent, I suppose in Vanuatu, I represent the political will to get this ICJ advisory opinion happening. And I am a member of parliament, so I have a lot more agency than, in the state to make something like this possibly happen. And one of the reasons why we want to see this happen, of course, is that, as Miguel says, we can talk about the facts and figures and what's happening endlessly, but Vanuatu has been ranked, by the United Nations University for the last 5 years in a row as the world's most disaster-prone country, and that's mostly due to the effects of climate change, which is an existential threat to our country. The costs of dealing with the effects of climate change are exorbitant and far exceed our national budget. And the amount of money we are able to access through the Green Climate Fund that was set up under the Paris Agreement and other climate financing avenues is just totally insufficient to meet the costs that we are incurring. And this is in a situation where Vanuatu itself contributes, 0.0001% of global emissions, which are recognized to be the cause of climate change. So we contribute the very least to the thing that is costing us the most. To give an example, just a couple of examples. Back in 2015, the first ever Category 5 cyclone in the South Pacific, or in the Pacific, Tropical Cyclone Pam, devastated Vanuatu and caused an estimated cost equivalent to 64.1% of our GDP. So that's 2/3 of our GDP in one single event. We then had the following, few years after, another cyclone that cost another similar proportion. And just this year, we've had Tropical Cyclone Harold, once again, over 60% worth of our GDP in a single event. So we are constantly having to allocate taxpayers' money to deal with reconstruction, response, and we are running behind. We are unable to meet it. And the question is, should we be the ones to meet this cost when we know that there's just, maybe 90 corporations in the world that generate over 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, make huge profits every year. These are the people responsible for the climate change that we're seeing, and yet they're not contributing in any way to the costs that we're incurring because of the climate change. So because of this, and due in part to the advocacy of students at the University of the South Pacific, which is the Pacific's university with campuses in many, many countries, is owned by 14 countries of the Pacific. And there is obviously a branch of the youth movement that Miguel belongs to, advocating. We decided, and myself as Minister of Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago, decided that we would try to push this idea of getting an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. We began consulting extensively with lawyers all over the world, with environmental law companies, with public law firms, with private lawyers, with different countries' diplomats, to see what the appetite was. And I remember we took a resolution to the Pacific Island Forum meeting in 2019, last year. And Vanuatu, via myself as Foreign Minister, we pushed a resolution that we wanted to see if the Pacific Island countries themselves could all sign up to supporting this idea of seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, because if we did have a resolution from the Pacific Islands Forum, that would be about 20 countries already signing up. And as we saw from the presentation by Miguel, we need a civil majority, or hopefully 2/3 of members of the United Nations in a General Assembly vote to support this idea of a advisory opinion so that the ICJ can consider this question. So it's a matter of getting those countries on board. So we managed to get the Pacific Islands Forum to note in its resolution this idea of seeking an advisory opinion from the ICJ, but it stopped short of endorsing this course of action. And the idea was that Vanuatu would have to do more research, find out more before we came back to the meeting this year to see if we'd get all the Pacific Island countries to sign on. And so we've done a lot of work since then. We held a meeting at the UNGA last year, which we invited a lot of experts and countries to come to try and socialize the idea. And we've managed to obtain funding support, which is crucial for diplomatic efforts as well as to pay for legal advice. And we have a legal team working on the particular question, because that seems to be the very, very important issue, is what exactly is the question you want asked. And things have been moving. Unfortunately, we've hit a couple of roadblocks just recently. The main one being we had a general election here in Vanuatu back in January, I think it was. And at that time, the party I represent and the parties we were in coalition with lost the majority. So we are now in opposition. And I've met the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, and others, but I'm trying to get the political will back into the government to continue this course of action that we started. So we are still working on that. But we've lost some momentum because we haven't managed to get the new government to fully sign on to this course of action yet. And the other one, of course, is COVID-19, the pandemic, which has resulted in a number of the meetings we were planning to hold and the advocacy we were planning to undertake not being able to be done. But I am confident, and what's been happening so far, I can see that there's a very clear trajectory going. With the advice we've been receiving, we've been trying to figure out what's the best approach, and there was some opinion saying that we should go by the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea as a better route to getting a quick legal opinion. But we managed to, after all the legal minds came together, it came back to say, no, the advisory opinion is the thing we should be going for, the single thing we should go for that would have the most effect. And we have to remember that Pacific Island countries were instrumental in getting the advisory opinion on the legality of nuclear weapons. So we do have a precedent. We do have something that we know that we were involved in it previously, we did it, so we can do it again. And I think it's only a matter of time. I think the momentum is building. We managed to socialize a lot of countries this idea. And I'm looking forward to, at one stage, whether it's Vanuatu or it isn't Vanuatu or it's a group of other countries, at some point this will get to the General Assembly. We were hoping this year, but as I said, that we hit a couple of roadblocks, but it could be as early as next year. And if that happens, we will get to the stage where after some years we get an advisory opinion. I mean, it's not obviously not quick enough, but it may, I think the effect of it on companies and countries that support those companies that are contributing the most to greenhouse gas emissions are being put on notice, and behavior will be changing regardless of whether, regardless of the fact that the advisory opinion has not been received yet or not been issued yet. I think the fact that it's happening, that there is something going towards establishing some sort of legal liability or legal responsibility, will see actions by governments to start to change their behavior. And I think it's already happening, not only as a result of this advisory opinion work, but also, of course, the Paris Agreement and various other instruments or activities that are going on. And of course, I'm very heartened by the recent win-in of the Biden administration coming back in, because that's really going to help the whole international field around climate action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Regenwanu. I think the important point here is that it's very impressive to see how small island states, just like Vanuatu, is taking a leadership role in this and pushing for action. And there's one question from the public that came through, and it is about how do you go about trying to convince other political leaders who do not see their interest or the urgency aligned with meeting the climate goals?
Well, you know, it is difficult. Politicians have a lot of other interests normally that do not necessarily align with climate action. It really is just a matter of talking, trading off interests. That's what we do at the in the foreign affairs sort of field, is say, look, let's do this and then we can do this, you know, trade off interests and that kind of thing. But it's something that I hope more and more we will see political leaders who see the urgency of this action, see the urgency of dealing with climate change, and see that the legal route is one that we must go down.
Thank you very much, Ralph. And I would like to invite Molly Kellogg to give her presentation now.
Just a second while I share my screen. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. Thanks very much, and thank you, Sylvia, for the and everybody else for the warm invitation to be here. It's really a pleasure, and I'm already inspired by the speakers that that have come before me. So thanks very much for giving me the floor as well. My name is Molly Kellogg. I work at the UN Environment Program at the United Nations, on a program that specifically focuses on gender, natural resources, climate change, peace, and security. So that is a mouthful. But I work on a partnership program between 4 different UN agencies. So you'll see them listed on the screen: UN Environment, UN Women, the Department of Peacebuilding Affairs, and UNDP. That focuses on how natural resources can act as an entry point to engaging women in governance and also in conflict resolution. And so through this program, we have developed a special focus on climate change because we saw the ways in which climate change was impacting security, and that these impacts had particularly gendered dimensions. And at the same time, the emerging discussions on climate change and security we felt were lacking a clear gender perspective, while as well the Women, Peace and Security agenda that focuses, of course, on differentiated risks and opportunities that women experience in times of conflict, was not fully considering climate change and environmental factors in their agenda. So this year we created an opportunity to look more deeply at these linkages between gender, climate change, and security, with really the objective to put gender on the agenda in climate change and security discussions, and also to advocate for climate considerations in women, peace and security discussions, resolutions, action. So in June, we published this report that Sylvia mentioned at the beginning, which includes 11 case studies and is an effort to consolidate the evidence around the world that from researchers and practitioners who see these linkages in their work. So the report includes 11 case studies from across the globe that look at different dimensions of security, but also different impacts of climate change in these different areas. And this piece of work helped us to conceptually sort of unpack these linkages between gender, climate change, and security. And I'll try to kind of quickly show this before moving into discussing some of the case studies. So quickly, what do we mean by gender? Gender refers to the socially constructed rather than biological attributes associated with being male or female. But as we've heard already in the presentations before, gender is absolutely not a factor in isolation, and we'll do ourselves a disservice by thinking of gender of women and men as two homogeneous groups. And in fact, it's recognizing the ways that gender intersects and overlaps with other factors of identity, ethnic identity, socioeconomic status, age, etc., that help us to understand the specific risks that different groups of people experience related to security as well as climate change. So how are these concepts connected? So first, let's take a look at the linkages between climate change and peace and security. So we know that there's no direct causal link between climate change and insecurity, but it's clear that climate change hazards can exacerbate drivers of insecurity. For example, through impacts on livelihoods or the destruction of homes or critical infrastructure after a disaster or a storm, as well as competition over increasingly scarce resources caused by the impacts of climate change. And at the same time, we know that insecurity can undermine community and people's capacity to adapt to climate change impacts. For example, through local conflict, further limiting a certain group's ability to access increasingly scarce resources. And this can really create a negative cycle in which poor adaptivity to climate change exacerbates conflict drivers, while insecurity limits further groups' capacity to adapt to climate change. So, sorry, the technology challenges. And gender norms and power dynamics determine how both women and men and boys and girls experience risks in both of these areas for a number of reasons, but I'll give a few examples. So we know that gender underpins, for example, how men and women use or manage resources affected by climate change, such as drought, differentiated roles in agriculture. And we also know that gender underpins economic opportunities. So who is able to find a job often or receive economic support often depends on things like access to finance, access to education, or different skills. Physical mobility, which is often linked to economics, but also to cultural or social norms that affects who can get out of the way during an extreme weather event or a flood, or who migrates during times of crisis. Decision-making power at the household level, but also, as we've heard from previous speakers, at national or international policy making circles, which dictates what issues become priority issues in the first place, etc. So how do these dimensions and these conceptual linkages, what does that mean in reality? So I'll give a couple of examples that are close to my work and also illustrated in the report through some of the case studies. The first is from North Kordofan, Sudan. This is an area where the joint program that I work on has a program that specifically looks at ways natural resources can help to engage women in governance as well as in conflict resolution. So this is Al Rahad, a village, which is home to both farmers and pastoralist communities who rely on natural resources in different ways for their livelihoods, to sustain their livelihoods. And climate change is affecting both the availability and the reliability of these critical resources. So rising temperatures, significant variability in distribution of rainfall is changing the reliability of and access to fertile land. Localized droughts have contributed to crop failure and soil degradation. And so together, these factors are compounding tensions that between resource user groups, including between pastoralists and farming communities, which has sometimes resulted in violence. Of course, climate change is not a factor in isolation, so we know this is happening in a context with many other dimensions as well. But one of the impacts is that faltering livelihoods from these converging issues is also leading to the outmigration of men from this village, from Al Rahad, who are seeking alternative livelihoods in other parts of the country. And this is creating some interesting gender dynamics because women are now increasingly heads of households back in Al Rahad. So this can, of course, create particular risks and distinct risks for both men that are migrating, but also women who are left behind. But we also thought to look at recognizing some of the opportunities for engaging women in new ways. And recognizing some of these opportunities can help us in an integrated and comprehensive way, can help us meet some of these three different distinct goals. So what does this mean? So for example, the increasingly feminized space, or a space increasingly occupied by women in Al Rahad, has led to women taking on new jobs and roles that have been traditionally reserved for men or occupied by men, especially around income generation and natural resource management, as they're now primary providers in many households. And our project saw that these shifting dynamics was also an opportunity to engage women in other roles which had previously been dominated by men, including in governance and decision-making, in local resource management bodies. So on the left, you'll see a picture of women participating in a process to identify environmental challenges in their community and also design solutions to those challenges. And on the right, you see women participating in a training related to conflict mediation and resource management. And this approach had really positive impacts, both for improving women's livelihoods, but also for increasing women's participation in local governance bodies and natural resource management committees, because we saw that natural resources and focusing on natural resources as opposed to just political engagement provided sort of a neutral entry point to engage traditionally excluded or marginalized communities. And so quickly, I'll also, I know I'm stretched for time, but quickly to look at an urban context. This is Freetown, Sierra Leone, the capital city of Sierra Leone. And it's a coastal city with a very unique topography, including steep hills and a lot of coastline, which has experienced rapid urbanization in the wake of Sierra Leone's civil war. And this combination of conflict and urbanization have also contributed to the depletion of natural resources in this challenging topography, including mass deforestation of the hills, stone mining, the destruction of coastal mangroves, the traditional barriers that would help to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change, such as heavier rains or rising sea levels that are now contributing to extreme flooding and mudslides. So you might recall a couple of years ago in 2017, there was a huge mudslide on the outskirts of the city that killed more than 1,000 people. And this rapid urbanization also led to the quick expansion of informal settlements, often in some of the most challenging parts of the city. So it's the residents who are living in the city's informal settlements who are the most exposed to natural disasters and climate-related risks, and also the poorest, have the fewest resources to get out of harm's way, have the fewest resources to build strong infrastructure, etc. And on top of this, women in Sierra Leone face high levels of gender inequality, including limited representation in government, lower levels of education, literacy, high rates of sexual and gender-based violence. And I think that this quote on the screen from Dr. Nana Pratt, who's a leading gender rights advocate, gender equality advocate in Sierra Leone, kind of sums it up, that climate change causes a lot of insecurity, is exacerbating insecurity, and it is reversing whatever gains we have made from development. Who suffers when there is a reversal in growth and in development or in economic opportunities? Women suffer. But it is, I don't want to be too pessimistic here, because it is in recognizing the ways while recognizing the ways gender inequality shape risks, it's also really important to recognize the many contributions women are making to building resilience, both informal and as well as informal structures. So I'll end with this image of a group of women members from a network called the Federation for Urban and Rural Poor in Freetown, who's a volunteer network operating in the informal settlements of more than 3,000 residents. And it's organized through community savings groups, which improve everyone's access to finance, but they also help to mobilize and address climate-related risks more directly. For example, going house to house and educating their neighbors how to stay safe during heavy storms. They collect data in their communities where data is usually scarce, particularly in informal settlements, such as on population or demographics. And this structure of, if I may call it, informal governance is absolutely not unique to Freetown. But I bring it up because women often play a leading role in informal governance structures, even when they are underrepresented in formal governance structures. But often these structures and these groups lack the same type of recognition or legitimacy when it comes to implementing climate or security-related policy. So finally, to leave you with a couple of thoughts and recommendations for how do we for leveraging opportunities to amplify the voices and actions of women in climate change and in peace and security discussions. The first is, from a UN perspective, integrating complementary policy agendas. So I talked about the Women, Peace and Security agenda and the climate change and security action. And we're seeing some really promising influence already in the aftermath of the report. So for example, this year, for the first time, the Secretary General's annual report on women, peace and security included a dedicated section to climate change, which is exciting. The second is to scale up programming that integrates gender equality, climate action, and peace and security goals. And as the speakers before me have absolutely noted, it is in looking at these issues together and as one full piece, one full interlinked challenges, but also solutions that will really start to see action that addresses these three different dimensions. Increasing targeted financing, I think this one speaks for itself, and expanding the evidence base. So one of the privileges of working on this report was to see actually how much evidence there is indeed on gender, climate change, insecurity already at this nexus. But it also pointed out some critical gaps and areas for further exploration. So I guess the more you know you don't know. So continuing to expand the evidence base and bring in new research in this area. So thanks very much for taking the time, and back over to you.
Thank you so much, Molly, for this very informative presentation. I think this really helps all of us to put things a little bit in context, like reflecting back to our previous speakers, how Chief Roseanne was talking about the experiences of First Nations in the northern regions, and both Miguel and Mr. Reagan, when we were reflecting on the existential threat of small island states. And the case studies that you have discussed yourself, it really demonstrates how climate change might not be directly linked to insecurity, but definitely creates additional tensions on the local level, but also exacerbates global challenges. So thank you very much. Just one quick question before we move to our next speaker. One that came through right now is, what role do women play in preventing climate conflicts? Could you reflect a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. Exactly. I mean, this is a good question and an important one. Women play a huge role, and I apologize if I over-focused on the negative aspects or the challenges, but this is what I was trying to get with at the end of our case studies. First of all, we know that women have particularly unique roles when it comes to natural resource management often, but that their knowledge, similarly to Indigenous groups, is lost or marginalized or entirely excluded from policymaking around climate change. So bringing in women's particular specific knowledge when it comes to natural resource management is one huge role that women play. The same goes for peace and security. Women often play really important roles, especially at the community level when it comes to mediation or conflict prevention, but are often excluded from higher level peace and security mediation or conflict resolution mechanisms, etc. So it's elevating the voices and amplifying the capacities that women already possess into other areas to overcome some of the structural inequality that we know exists based on gender, that can help kind of ensure that women's capacities are fully capitalized on.
Thank you very much, Molly, indeed. And Ms. Anya Olin-Pape, if you are still with us, hopefully, could you please deliver your presentation?
Hi, Sylvia. Yes, I'm still with you, and I'm still really
Thank you.
I'm really inspired by all of the speakers, so I've decided to go off script a bit and leave my PowerPoint presentation behind, because we have such an excellent panel with us today, and it's really been both enlightening and really, really inspiring to hear. I want to give a more structural perspective on youth engagement and youth inclusion. But before I go into that, I wanted to shortly present also the work that we do at the Global Challenges Foundation around climate change. We are a foundation focusing on global catastrophic risks and the global governance aspects of those risks. So how can we mitigate, for example, climate change or environmental degradation by also enhancing the global governance structures that we have today, but also sort of being a bit imaginative and seeing what kind of global governance structures would actually be needed to really be able to deal with these kinds of global catastrophic risks that we're facing. In our work, we're conducting a lot of research through our Climate Risk Governance Commission that is compiled of experts from across the globe, where we're looking into sort of global governance barriers towards implementing a lot of the policy that we know we have at hand that would actually bring us closer to realizing the 1.5 degrees ambition. We're looking into, for example, barriers to circular economy and key governance innovations to facilitate deep circular economy, or mapping climate governance within key progressive states and progressive alliances of states to see how those states, what they might need from an international community to really continue on the path that they're already on. We're looking into novel mechanisms to raise the high levels of international funding necessary to tackle the climate challenge at a global level. And we're also doing interviews with progressive companies on sort of bottlenecks and what they see as the greatest barriers to ambitious climate action. We're looking into how to move closer to a global price on carbon and also on international legal reforms, like what was already been mentioned here today. We're working closely with an initiative called the Exponential Roadmap, which really is looking into how we can meet the 1.5 degrees ambition by highlighting 36 specific solutions that can scale exponentially on a global level to have the greenhouse gases by emissions on emissions by 2030 worldwide. And this is really sort of our core idea to also look into how policy can really be exponentially increase globally to realize these ideas. And I urge you to also look into the exponential roadmap further. But of course, what I'm doing at the foundation and what I'm really most passionate about is youth involvement, youth in climate action. So in our commission's work, we also have youth networks representing sort of young people and youth organizations from across the globe. They are both giving us advice on how to move forward, but also participating as experts in the work of the commission. We're still building the structures, but it's a really exciting way to also bring in the grassroots sort of experiences and expertise of young people into the commission's work on sort of how global governance reform could be realized. Another interesting topic, and connecting to the previous speaker, is that we're looking into sort of youth peace and climate action. So just like women peace and climate action, how can young people be agents of change, and how can we also look into the connections between security and peace, the security and peace movement with the climate action movement that we've seen so vocally over the globe for the past couple of years. And connected to this, we're very much working with the Stockholm Plus 50 team to also ensure that young people are really at the core, not only in developing or in participating in the conference, but as well as setting the agenda and being involved in its preparations, and being able to also have a say in sort of the priorities set for the conference itself. But when we look at youth participation, it's really something that is on the agenda of many talks and of many organizations these days. It's become a little bit modern to work with young people, especially since we've had the great successes and great breakthrough work of the Fridays for Future movement, but also other youth networks across the globe for the past couple of years. And of course, the energy and the way that they have been able to set the agenda and turn the agenda towards sort of the urgency of the climate catastrophe has really elevated the discussions worldwide. But I think it's also now important to think about how we can even further work with these networks and with these young people to also really bring them into the decision-making processes and make sure that they have meaningful youth participation. My background is from the Council of Europe, where I worked with sort of youth policy with governments for the past 4 years. And in the Council of Europe, there's a structure where young people and governments actually take all the decisions that concern young people together. And it's, from my experience, it also really showcases that once young people and civil society and governments meet and take decisions together, the connection to the local level becomes better. You have more progressive and more far-reaching policies, and you have also a better way of implementing the policy that you've reached on sort of a regional level, because the grassroots connection is already there. So it's my conviction that involving young people in political decision-making processes also renders better results of those said processes. But of course, it's also, and what we can see now with the youth and young people being such a sort of priority target group for so many organizations, is also quite varied ways of involving young people. And it's incredibly important here to make sure that when we invite young people, we also do it so that they can participate in a meaningful way, that we don't look at them as tokenistic, children or young people who are really good to have in the photos or in the program, but also make sure that their views, their expertise, and their experiences are taken seriously, and also end up really meaning something for the program, that they have a true way of influencing the outcomes of conferences, negotiations, or so on. I was also asked to discuss and talk a little bit, how can we help? How can we in the international community sort of elevate and advance this great engagement that young people have? And I mean, Manuel is an excellent example, but there are, of course, thousands more examples of youth organizing themselves and really advocating and bringing sort of demands for great changes to how we organize ourselves as an international community. And I mean, one thing is really just to make sure that we listen and echo the demands of the young people and the youth movements. But it's also incredibly important, I think, that we look into representation. We know that only about 2% of the world's parliamentarians are under 35. So it's very clear that there is a huge lack of representation of young people in processes that are decision making. It's also very evident that what young people are usually lacking is access to networks, access to other experts, access to politicians and influential people. And that's where we also have to step up and make sure that we invite and give access to these platforms and processes to the young people who are experiencing the effects of climate change already today. I think it's also very important to see how sort of we can bring in more local experiences to the global level, that we are also working even to make sure that on an international level, we're working even closer to the grassroots and the young people on the ground, forming these great networks of sort of climate activists. And lastly, but maybe absolutely not least, is to ensure that we have strong civil society support. We know that across the globe and in many countries, young people are really struggling to also just be able to form their own organization, to state their opinions, and to be advocates and activists around these issues. And we can't forget that in order to also bring even more activism and more engagement from young people, we also have to make sure that human rights are acknowledged and safeguarded, and that young people actually have the possibilities to organize themselves. So sort of the space for civil society is incredibly important to expand even. And as well as precarious situations for young people, where if you have 3 jobs and you also have to, go to school and get master's diplomas for entry-level jobs, you also maybe don't have time to really engage in the issues that are most dearest to you. So it's important to also look into the entire welfare system surrounding young people in general. I wanted to finish off by also giving a quote from Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, to acknowledge that young people are an enormous asset to our societies. We must cherish them, invest in them, and empower them. And it's important that we today change from a perspective where young people are usually said to be a problem or sort of the difficulties, the victims of all different situations, and make sure that we see them as real agents of change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anya. And just towards the end of your presentations, you were talking about how difficult and overwhelming it may become for young people who have their studies, they're working in jobs, and they also bear this heavy burden of this climate change activism, which somehow becomes a requirement for them to do. And this relates closely to one of the questions which came through, and that is about how do we combat activist fatigue and becoming overwhelmed by the persistent lack of mobilization by national and global political institutions?
Yeah, that's a really good question and a serious concern. And I think there are many answers to that question. And of course, the easiest would be to actually now get down and fix the climate crisis, so that young people wouldn't have to, champion their rights for a long and sustainable life and for their and future generations. But I think it's also very important, again, to come back to the idea of meaningful participation versus tokenistic, because young people are engaged in so many processes where they are wanting to be heard but are not listened to, and that takes so much energy and so much of your time. And if we would be able to actually build structures where young people are at the seat of the table in decision-making processes, it also basically gives your engagement a lot more respect and feedbacks back to the youth movements who are sort of pushing for these topics. So to really make sure that whenever we involve young people, it's meaningful and they're really heard, I think is the most important aspect as well.
Thank you very much, Anya, for that. Now we have had all the presentations. Thank you again for all our guests today to contribute to this very important discussion. And we have about 30 minutes left before we conclude today's session, and that we would like to dedicate, of course, to a Q&A session. And while we are waiting for some additional questions to come in, I have a few more received already. And one of those was directed to Mr. Regenwanu. Let me just quickly find it back. Right, so Mr. Regenwanu, there was a question coming addressed to you, and that was, what are the current development and legal development regarding potential climate migration, and what has been voted in the Parliament recently, if you have the freedom to share that with us?
Did you say climate migration?
Climate migration, indeed. The question is about what is the current legal and political development regarding climate migration?
Okay, well, I'm not abreast of what's happening in that area legally. I know that it's an issue that's being raised by a number of the smaller Pacific Island countries, particularly the atoll countries, and there are developments in terms of agreements being made with some of our larger neighboring countries, but I can't say that I can speak on that topic. Regarding Parliament, things being passed lately of relevance to this topic, I think, we've had to do amendments regarding the amount of the budget that can be spent without Parliament passing the appropriation in cases of emergency. And that's just having to increase. So we are lifting the threshold. It used to be 1.5% of the national budget can be spent without going to Parliament first, because you are responding to an emergency. We're having to constantly increase the amount and provide less, make it easier for the government to spend money without going through the process of appropriation in Parliament and scrutiny. And that's one of the major things that's been happening in terms of each year we see more necessity to have more possibility of spending public funds on, because every year we're having these disasters happen. The government has to respond immediately, and then we have to come back to Parliament to legalise that spending through voting it in Parliament. So I suppose that's the major thing that's happening in Parliament in this regard.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Regenwanu. And there is another question which is addressed to Chief Roseanne, although I think this could be also very much relevant for Molly to address. But maybe we could start with Chief Roseanne. And there is a question, are Indigenous women, First Nations women, more adversely affected by climate change? And if so, what can be done to afford them a better protection? Chief Roseanne? In the meantime, Molly, perhaps you could reflect a little bit on that. In your experience, are women, Indigenous rural women, more adversely affected by climate change? And more importantly, what can be done to afford them a better protection?
Yeah, sure. I would start off by saying that I think as I've kind of mentioned through my presentation, there's absolutely no one way that women are affected by climate change, including Indigenous women. But part of what makes accurate risk assessment accurate is by looking at the intersectional dimensions of identity that help to kind of draw out some of what we could say are layered layers of marginalization. So gender inequality layered on other dimensions that would contribute to higher levels of exclusion or marginalization. That said, it is not only, women are not always the victims, and gender shapes vulnerability as well for men and other gender groups in different ways. So I will not speak for the First Nation communities because that's not my field of expertise, but I can maybe reflect on that a little bit in the Sahel, some of the dynamics that we're seeing. For example, norms of masculinity shaping men's expectations for men to be primary providers, coupled with degraded livelihoods, in some cases has served as motivation to join armed groups or take on negative coping strategies that would serve to kind of fill this void that's created by climate change. So sorry, I'm not sure if that fully answered the question, but just to say that these intersectional identities and risks are really critical to understanding how different groups experience climate change and insecurity.
Thank you very much, Molly. Let me just quickly check again with Chief Roseanne. I'm not sure whether there is a connection problem. Chief Roseanne, are you still with us? I'm going to ask another question because we have plenty to come in, and there is a question which has been addressed to both Miguel and Mr. Regenwanu as well, and this is related to the efforts to trigger an advisory opinion from the ICJ. And the question is, what are the kind of state obligations that this campaign would expect the ICJ to establish? So either Miguel or Mr. Regenwanu, if you would be able to reflect on that. What state obligations are you envisaged that the ICJ will be able to establish in this context?
If I may come in, there's an obligation, for example, under the United Nations Law of the Sea, not to pollute the ocean. And emissions, warming, causing global warming, which warms the oceans, is polluting the ocean. And so a country could argue that the state that is allowing emissions to the level where they contribute to global warming, which is raising the temperature of the ocean, is in breach of. But of course that means that the other state has to be a signatory to UNCLOS, the law of the sea. That's one example I'll give.
Thank you very much, Mr. Regenwanu. And Miguel, what is the youth campaign emphasizing in this regard?
Thank you. Well, we can't, of course, predict exactly what the International Court of Justice will decide, and this is, one of the things that has worried some people who are joining our campaign as well. There's this fear that there might be the advisory opinion might not actually be in benefit of climate change. But the way we see it, the states do have an obligation to protect their citizens, and this it's actually crazy that that climate change has not been included in this yet, because citizens are not being protected from the effects of climate change, which has been, some of the some of the biggest environmental disasters that we've seen in the last few years have been proven to have some connection to climate change, whether it's because, these disasters are increased in frequency or increased in intensity. And so I assume that the states would have some obligation to make sure that, whether it's through mitigation, to make sure that that these happenings do not increase for citizens, or whether it's through adaptation, that citizens have the resilience to actually be able to adapt to what is happening. So that's a bit of a general answer, but I don't think we can't predict the specifics, of course.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Another question coming in. We have a lot of questions coming in, so that's good news. We have triggered some discussion here. And another question addressed to Anya. How do you view attempts of young activists to have an impact through climate change litigation, such as the case before the European Court of Human Rights?
I think just as what Miguel is doing, that it's an excellent approach and that it should be furthered more from the international community. I mean, the rule-based approach towards climate change mitigation is really key, I think, in sort of developing our global cooperation as well, and making sure that, because climate change is obviously not something that any one single country can combat on their own or address on their own. It's really something that we are having to go through together and deal with together. And in that sense, I think that these claims and towards, the rule-based approach is really sort of key in finding ways to develop our global cooperation as well.
Thank you very much, Anya. Another question for Mr. Regenwanu. Which Pacific islands are at the core of getting an ICJ advisory opinion? Are there any states that do not agree with this campaign in your experience?
Okay, so as I said, Vanuatu is the only one that sort of was really pushing it. And we took a resolution to the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Summit last year. And we managed to get a mention that it was an interesting idea that the leaders would consider. So at least it appeared in the text, but it wasn't able to get the unanimous support we were hoping for. And interestingly, some of the main pushback was an idea that this route would negatively affect negotiations under the Paris Agreement, for example. That if we started to take the legal route, that would then potentially damage our ability to negotiate with these countries. By the fact that we're taking, going to seek a legal opinion which might make them legally liable. And that was the main argument we encountered in terms of pushback from other Pacific Island countries. In fact, there was only one other country that really was pushing that line that resulted in us not being able to achieve a unanimous endorsement. But yeah, that was the concern. But as I said, right now it seems that Vanuatu was the only country pushing it, and at the moment we're trying to get the new government to re-engage and continue that push. But other than that, there seems to be, although the awareness is being raised and it's now on everyone's agenda and it appeared in the resolution of the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Summit, there still needs to be a lot of work done to get actually commitment from Pacific Island countries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Raganwanu. Another question addressed to Molly. What is your professional opinion on climate refugees? The UNHRC has finally acknowledged that the rising sea levels might justify a broadening of the 1951 Refugee Convention.
My professional opinion, that's a tough one. Well, I will say I'm not a refugee specialist by any means, but of course there are all sorts of challenges with using the word refugee as from a legal challenges with using the word refugee as it pertains to climate change in particular. So I think that yeah, I'd have to refer to maybe our legal specialist to answer this question. But absolutely on displacement and migration more generally, I'd be happy to touch upon that. There is the way we approach migration and displacement as it relates to climate change and other factors. We know that migration is extremely complex, and oftentimes there is not one driver of migration and displacement. It's often a mix of factors, but at the same time, and indeed migration and displacement can create new tensions or concerns as it relates to peace and security, and also new or increased pressures on the environment in receiving places. So in my presentation, I talked about Sierra Leone, in which climate change and conflict are both, and continue, no longer conflict, but continue to be factors that push urbanization. But in Freetown, there's a whole nother slew of challenges related to climate change and the environment in a place that is receiving population rise at a rate that sort of outpaces sustainable development. So IOM describes this quite eloquently, and in the way they think about climate-related displacement, looking at protecting populations that prefer to stay in their locations, and ensuring that through a rights-based approach, they have the capacity to stay. Also protecting and supporting communities that are migrating, and as migration is sometimes unavoidable, it's also a choice. And protecting communities and populations in receiving areas. So I think thinking about, the classification of refugee aside, but thinking about those three areas is really critical to protecting groups that are at risk of displacement or migration.
Thank you very much, Molly. Unfortunately, it seems that we have lost connection with Chief Roseanne. There are several questions addressed to her. We will see whether we can reestablish the connection. But in the meantime, we also have a question to Miguel. It is often suggested that climate change claims would be more successful before a human rights court. What is your opinion on this?
So the question is, would it?
It seems that many criticize the very difficult, obviously, route to ICJ, because it seems that such claims concerning climate change would be more successful before a human rights court rather than the International Court of Justice. And your opinion would be appreciated on this.
Yeah. Well, I personally think let's tackle this from all possible sides. So, if we can go to the ICJ and we can go to human rights courts at the same time. I mean, climate change, and that is also what makes it so different from any other issue that we have faced, is that climate change affects every single part of our society. So it's going to affect our human rights, but it's going to affect our GDPs, our infrastructure. Is going to affect our international relations, and not just going to, but it already is. It has already started to. So I think, because climate change is so widespread, because the climate crisis is such a big issue, I do think that the International Court of Justice, being the highest court in the world, is very, very appropriate to face this question. Of course, it is a human rights issue. And so if we can go to human rights courts at the same time, I would say let's do that too. That would be my answer. Thanks for the question.
Indeed, those legal routes are not mutually exclusive. I mean, one does not exclude the access to the other. One more question which has been posed to Anya. How can young people reach out to you if they have projects that they would like to gain momentum? Can the foundation be helpful in this?
Absolutely. We're happy to discuss any sort of ideas for projects that covers climate or global catastrophic risks and global governance reforms. So if you're interested in getting in touch, you can just reach out either through social media or at anya@globalchallenges.org.
Okay, so please, in our audience, if you have projects aimed at climate activism, I think we all would encourage you to get in touch, right?
Yes, we're also trying to live as we learn and make sure that, or live as we preach, to make sure that we extend our networks and our sort of partners, and make sure that even if we're not always the best fit, that we can find a good organizational fit and experts for anyone who gets in touch with us. So please do.
Thank you very much, Anya, for that. Mr. Regenwarner, if I may to address one more question to you, which came through the chat. You have described this very urgent and existential threat your community is facing in Vanuatu, and I believe pretty much similar in other small island states. And the question is, do you think we can actually live in harmony with nature in a world with economic growth as its main priority? Or do we really need a shift on that, shifting the focus away from economic growth?
Yeah, the short answer is no, we can't.
Okay.
I think everyone knows.
What do you propose? How are we going to then grow up for this and meet these challenges? If we keep focusing on
in the Pacific Islands, we've been living in harmony with nature for thousands of years, without a capitalist economic growth. So it shows that it's possible. In fact, the populations we have now in Vanuatu are about a third to a half of what used to be our populations prior to colonization and mass extinction of people due to diseases. So we've had much higher populations living in our countries within our environments. So yeah, we have to find a different way of living within our environments, and I think the indigenous cultures of the world show that we can do that, and I think it's a well-known fact that the indigenous territories around the world contain the most biodiversity in the world, and our lifeways that have maintained this biodiversity show that it is possible to live a sustainable model of living which protects the environment and lives in harmony with the environment.
Yes, indeed. I think your community and indigenous communities in general, they show us that it is actually possible. And there's a follow-up question on that. Seeking advice, so it seems, how can we make non-indigenous people understand their connection to their nature and land better? What advice could you give from your own experience in Vanuatu to people who would actually be willing to try to shift the focus?
As much as possible, if it's possible, where you are living, get to know the indigenous people in your territory. If you don't already, develop relationships with them, start to learn. That's what I think. That's what all indigenous people want. They want people who are non-indigenous to understand, what they are, where they are, and especially people living on indigenous territories who don't have relationships with the indigenous people of that territory. And that's the best way to learn to live in harmony with the nature that's around you, because the indigenous people are the people who have learned how to do that over thousands of years of living there.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we have not been able to re-establish connection with Chief Roseanne. But there is a question which has been addressed in general to all of the speakers. So please, any of you, if you feel like you can share your thoughts on that. With increasingly apparent impacts of climate change, persistent inequalities, and COVID-19 induced economic and health crisis, what can be done to ensure a just and inclusive green recovery?
I'm happy to answer that, and I'd also like to follow up on what Ralph Regan-Vanu was saying on the other questions, because I think that is a question that comes up a lot, and it's such an important one, which is when we relate climate change on the one hand to economic growth, and on the other hand as well to population growth. We first have this idea that we have too many people on the world, and so there's nothing we can do until we reduce our population. And I think it's a big lack of creativity and imagination in people's minds. Like this society, of course, this way that we're living in the society right now, probably no, because the system is already failing us right now. But as people, we have so many creative ways to live, and that's proven by the tens of thousands of cultures that we have around the world who have found ways to live, in the Arctic, who have found ways to live in the Amazon, who have found ways to live, on the coast, harvesting, pearls and shells from the bottom of the sea. Before we invented scuba diving, we have, and those are like traditional examples that I'm giving, but that's just to give an idea of like, we can do so much different from what we are doing now. And with regards to economic growth, there's already people thinking of new economic models there's this idea of donut economics that is rather popular right now, which is an economic model that actually takes our social and environmental needs into account and make sure that we are not, damaging the environment and decreasing or increasing our social inequalities and decreasing our quality of life because of the way that our economics are going. So we have a lot of possibilities with regards to that. And I think that's, going back to the question we just asked, with COVID-19 now, we have seen like our society has entirely flipped on its head, or like our life in the last year. And that shows us how quickly we can change things around. And it also shows us that we have to change things around now. We still haven't, even though that we have kind of, our lives feel like they have flipped on their heads, we are still doing the same thing that we were doing last year and 2 years ago. We're just doing it a little bit less now because we don't have the opportunity to go at full speed. So I think, we have to think of how we want to get out of this and how we want to shape our societies after this. And there's no one answer, but with the creativity that people have and the models that people are already thinking of, I think there's a lot of opportunities in how we do that. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that addition. We have a few minutes left before from the runtime of this webinar. But before I'm going to the closing of this event, I just want to make sure any other of our speakers would like to reflect on this briefly.
I might come in quickly. I think I couldn't agree more to what Miguel was already saying, but maybe also adding to this, I think that the past year has really shown us the sort of power in also political will, right? You can really see that if the will and the demand of the people is there to transform our societies for the good of the people, you can really, close borders or, divest or invest crazy amounts of money into new sectors. And I think that political will is something that we will have to take with us moving forward, also to reimagine our societies to be able to live in a climate neutral way, to both on a national level, but also on an international level, acknowledging that we really do need better structures on a global level to be able to overcome these great challenges that we're facing together.
Thank you very much, Anya, for that. Anyone else?
I'll add one final word. I also fully agree with both what Miguel and Anya have been saying. And one other opportunity, I think just from our own working experience, that COVID-19 has showed us is first the capacity for us to connect globally in ways that are not damaging to the environment. So this event as a prime example, bringing people together, bringing us together from all over the world with different expertise. We've seen, this is the blessing and the curse of online events and online fora and webinars. I think we're all sort of overwhelmed by the number of events, but at the same time, it's so cool to be able to connect with people that otherwise wouldn't be able to join an in-person event because of things like expenses, visa requirements, etc. So for me, it's really been an eye-opening way of working and something that I'm sure will continue to be central to all of the work moving forward beyond COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Molly, for that. And yes, we have about 4 minutes left. So I would just like to take this opportunity and thank you all the speakers so much for being us with today, accepting this invitation and sharing your experiences and insights on this very important topic and issues. I think what has become really clear, and it has been mentioned a couple of times in the past 2 hours, that we really need to be more active in establishing relationships and establishing partnerships, because we are dealing with these challenges posed by climate change, not in isolation, but this is something which really intersects with other tensions and pressures, whether it's gendered or ethnic dimensions. And we need an integrated approach. We need to tackle these issues together as a cross-cutting security concern. But we also need to, in my view, need an integrated approach in terms of the various actors actually working together, joining forces and amplifying these voices. Youth activism, governmental efforts from the Pacific, which we have seen today, but also the civil society action and the very impressive efforts of Molly and others within the UN Environmental Programme to try to incorporate these issues on the more cross-cutting level on the United Nations. So for me too, it was very inspirational and very much eye-opening. And thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you also for all our guests to bearing with us and joining in the discussion, and for the very interesting questions, of course. Thank you again, and take good care in these difficult times, and see you soon again.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for organizing. Fantastic event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sylvia and the speakers and everyone who asked questions. Take care.